Hey, y'all. Welcome back to Fishing for Men. We're starting a new series today, and it's going to be about purpose. And so we're just going to kind of walk through this a little bit over the course of about 4 or 5 different episodes. But just coming to you now, we're in February, and New Year's resolutions are probably either plummeted or you're pushing on strong. And so just kind of want to check in with all those listeners out there, maybe a little reminder to get those resolutions back up. It's been about a month. So, or just an encouragement to say, hey, maybe you did miss a day or two at the gym. Get back in there. Keep working out. And so, just wanted to make that call up. But before we kind of get started tonight, let's go ahead and introduce who we have here today. To my left.
This is Cody.
Hey, y'all, it's Spencer.
Hey, it's Cole.
Hey, everyone, it's Brandon.
How's all his week going?
Pretty good.
That's it? Only one of you has an answer?
I've been struggling with that response, actually. The other day, I text my wife. I said, how's your day going? She said, good. And she goes, how's yours? I was like, good. And then 15 minutes later, I sent her a novel. I was like, actually, to be honest, this is how my day is going. And now I get the chills about it because usually, like in passing, when we see each other at church or anything and we ask that question, it's going all right.
Good,
like
busy.
That's all we ever say.
We're getting through it.
Yeah. That is actually better than good. Because at least we know like you're honesty. Human, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I do appreciate that. I actually do that with my team a lot. They're like, hey, how's it going? Good.
What does good mean?
What would it mean for it to be great?
Oh, yeah. That's another good question. Yeah.
Or I get a lot of, it's okay. Just okay. What about good? Like, what would make your day better? And just kind of just poke at them a little bit. But we do. We rush through that a lot of, I'm good. Or busy. That's the other one.
Yeah.
Again, and Brandon knows that one all too well.
He doesn't let me go with that answer. So I'll offer more today. Okay. I had lunch with a good friend, and my boss who went through some medical stuff, he was in a medically induced coma for 8 days, is out of the hospital.
Oh,
awesome. I saw him on screen for the first time today, and man, was he chatty, which was good. Wow. He just wanted to talk. He's like, I missed you. And I was like, okay. So
that's great.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Answered prayers right there. Awesome.
Yeah. For sure. Well, as we kind of jump into this, the question that we're just going to talk about is, what the heck are we really doing here? And maybe you've never thought about this question before. Maybe this is the first time it's coming up. Maybe you have thought about this question. What I found is this question usually hits you at some point after some sort of big life event, whether it's having a child, whether it's potentially death in the family, or medically induced coma, or just something big happened.
Good old-fashioned midlife crisis.
Yeah, sure. Go buy that Corvette. Whatever that looks like what are we really doing here? And I heard this quote is from Dr. Neil Frank, and he said, the great tragedy in this world is that many of us have not taken the time to understand what living is all about. And I just found that quote fascinating, that we run through our life so fast. And actually, we were sitting in students tonight, and I don't remember how she actually got on this topic, but she said the two things that most people regret are worrying too much and like spending too much time at work. But we run through life so fast that we get to the end, like, oh, I forgot about all this stuff that I wish I would have done. And so I would just encourage you, anybody that's listening, is spend some time thinking about this question. Like, what are you doing here? And so personally, as I've kind of investigated this a little bit and just kind of started working through it, through what God calls us to do, and where he kind of has us, what our purpose is according to him, it really kind of falls into two categories or parts. One is a general purpose that all of us have. It's the same for every single person that's out there. And then there's a more specific one. We're going to spend most of our time in this series really talking about the general purpose, because usually when you start with the general purpose, it really starts to take shape into the specific one. At least that's what I found in my own experience. And so for today, we're going to talk about where it all starts and what everything stems from, and that's loving God. with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength. And this is actually, I'm going to start in actually Mark 12. And this is Mark 12, 28 through 34. One of the teachers, and this is a part in Mark where many of the different scribes and Pharisees are actually coming up to Jesus and I would say trying to challenge him or trick him or
Into saying something he shouldn't be, so
yeah,
they can trap
yeah.
him.
They're
Yep.
trying to trap him or try to like I gotcha. And so this teacher of the law, it says one of the teachers of the law came and heard them debating, noticing that Jesus had a good answer. He asked them, "Of all the commandments, which is the most important?" The most important one, Jesus answered Jesus, is this: "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all of your heart and with all of your soul and with all of your mind and with all of your strength. The second is this: love your neighbor as yourself. There is no commandment greater than these." "Well said, teacher," the man replied. I found that funny. Well said. Well said, teacher. Like he didn't have, I think he got the answer he was looking for. "You are right in saying that God is one and there is no other but him. To love him with all of your heart, with all of your understanding, with all of your strength, to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices." When Jesus saw that he had answered wisely, he said, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." And from then on, no one dared ask him any more questions. Initial thoughts here. I'm just curious anything that pops into mind as he reads this. Or actually, he would have just been speaking and not reading it.
I think one thing that stands out to me is it's a very broad question, and the answer is interesting to me because what Jesus quotes here, the hero Israel, that's a Jewish prayer. Well, it's a quote from Old Testament scripture. I believe it's called the Shema.
Yep.
And
In
it's
Deuteronomy.
Yeah, in Deuteronomy. And they pray it constantly, like
at least twice a day.
Yeah. And so everyone knows this. It's something they would have heard.
It's one of the first things you actually
daily.
teach your kids if you're Jewish.
And so it's in that sense, it's like it's super obvious, but it's super basic, but it permeates like every part of your life, right? So it's hard to actually live and carry out.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah, like
the simplicity of it, but also how like deep it is.
Yeah.
But yeah, it seemed just love God. Okay.
Yeah, and then
Thank
love
you
it,
for
and
that.
then love everybody else like you love God.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good summary. Yeah.
It's basic.
I think what sticks out to me is your call out on 32, that kind of like well said, teacher. One, just the recognition of the high priest of him to call him teacher was pretty impressive. But also then, if I'm interpreting this right, he then goes on to like offer up what I feel like is almost like a co-signing of what Jesus has just said, but in a way that I feel like is kind of counter to what most of like the Pharisees would normally do, which
It's
is
a critique, right?
it's almost like this is all of this is way more important than any burnt offerings and sacrifices, which were so important to the law and the customs of the time. So kind of interesting to hear somebody who is probably in that higher role within the temple kind of aligning with Jesus on this one. That didn't seem to be the norm at the time. He was kind of counter to that.
Just curious, Billy, do you know at the beginning of 28 where it says one of the teachers of the law came, do we know who that teacher is?
Mm-mm.
That'd be something interesting to look at.
No, some of them, like I looked at a couple of the questions they ask above, is either like a scribe or it doesn't say a specific teacher.
Okay.
It doesn't have a label like some of the other ones where it will say like a Sadducee or a scribe or a priest. It just says a teacher in this one. At
Interesting.
least in the translation that I looked at.
I'm gonna blue letter Bible that while we're talking.
Go for it.
So another thought that comes to mind, and this is a question for you guys here and the listeners, is what keeps us from loving everyone like we love God?
Ego,
Like
pride, control.
Yeah,
fear,
where's our
anxiety.
grace?
Well,
Where's
you
our
think
grace
about
at?
not to dive into politics, but a couple months ago we
Yeah.
had an election, and we saw like tensions rise in the country, and we
Mhm.
repeat that every 4 years. Think about maybe the way you felt in that when you heard people that you disagree with, different issues on talking, how you felt. That can make it tough to love someone.
It can.
The
It can,
decisions
but
they make, if you don't agree with them making the right decision or making the decision that you think is right, or making a decision where they should have made one in their current stage of life, I think it's hard sometimes to be like, yeah, you should have done that there.
yeah. Call me weak or call me a doormat, but I'd like to keep it basic, like not judging people for their decisions and things that they've done, and just love them for who they are. I know it's harder said than done, but
Well, then we start getting into, what does the word love mean? An interesting place to be. Is love just accepting, or is love also challenging? Is love hard? Think about
yeah.
all the relationships
it's all
of
all
life
those
that we
things.
have, like
Yeah.
there's change, there's growth in love. There's not just saying, okay, I accept you and let you do whatever you want. I don't find that loving, just to let somebody, like, if I love somebody and I was watching them walk down a path that was going to lead to destruction,
Yeah.
I'm not going to let them just stop, or I'm not just going to let them keep going. Now, there is obviously also a part of love where you have to let somebody fail.
Yep.
Which God does that to us all the time. He lends us over to our own desires and says, okay, go. Brandon's looking at me like he's like,
No,
gonna
I-
say
my
something,
mind
or
went in
like-
a whole bunch of different directions. I just think about kind of in this day and age, we hear a lot about like, I want to live my truth,
Yep.
or if people disagree with us, like we'll take offense to that,
Mm.
and so we can kind of equate like happiness and love. And I mean, there can be some overlapping in those things, but I don't think they necessarily do all the time.
for sure.
Or yeah, it's something you said made me think about like with kids, right? Like we love them, but maybe sometimes we will coddle them or try to force success in a situation without them learning a lesson, maybe because of our own insecurities or trying to live through our kids, or even codependency maybe.
One thing that stuck out, well, actually, there's one thing that stuck out to me as I was actually reading this time, which was in the, I'll call it the validation from the teacher to Jesus of, hey, when he says, you're right, he says to love him with all of your heart, but he changes the second portion. Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul and mind. When he repeats it back to him, he says, with all of your understanding. I have no answer, more just a comment, maybe something to dig into. I just thought that was interesting. He doesn't repeat it exactly word for word back. And then he adds the burnt offerings and sacrifices too into that, which usually when there's different pieces, there's something there. And so I'm just maybe something to dig into afterward. The one thing that I did stick out to me is this idea of just beholding. And I think it's interesting that it doesn't say the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself and then love God. It says love God first. You go back to the 10 Commandments. It says have no other gods before me. I'm the only God, and don't have idols. Like it starts there, and then we get into the relational types of things. And so this idea of beholding, I think sometimes we skip over. We become a Christian and we don't take the time to recognize God for who he is. That takes a lifetime, for sure. It's not something you figure out in a 30-minute quiet time, but just recognizing all the characteristics of God and who he is and how grand and vast that is, that your mind can never even contain all of that, is just fascinating to me. And then just letting his words and promises, even just his presence, pour over you. Like, and you don't have to do anything. You just sit. You can just sit in his presence, and that is enough. Like that's where my mind went when I was reading this. And so as we kind of get into just a little bit of context of what this is, this was actually, the question that this teacher asked Jesus was actually a rabbinical debate that was going on at that time. It was between, there's two fields of thought. There was Rabbi Shammai and Rabbi Hillel. Every rabbi agreed that the number one commandment was love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your, or actually they didn't have mind in Hebrew. It was just strength. But the debate was the second piece. Shammai said the second greatest commandment was obey the Sabbath. Hillel said, love your neighbor. And this was actually what was called a rabbi's yoke and the lens through which they interpreted the rest of Scripture. And so I thought this was interesting. This actually was really mind-blowing to me whenever I first heard this, because I always thought Jesus was the first one to say, love your neighbor. He's not. He's actually taking Hillel's side in this debate that's going on. And I was like, what? This isn't a Jesus original? And so it was really interesting to kind of learn about that. And so he's just weighing into the debate that's going on and saying that, like, hey, loving your neighbor is really what is interesting there.
Yeah.
So Shammai could have sold it a little harder, and it could have been obey the Sabbath.
Could be. And it's not to say obeying the Sabbath isn't something you shouldn't do. It's one of the 10 Commandments, but the way that he interpreted everything was through rest, basically. Everything went back to that. And so everything that he'll do, all the stuff that he would go on to write, is always tied back into obeying the Sabbath. And you would put that, and you see that in different places in the Bible where some of the Pharisees, not all of them, they're not all the same, but there are some Pharisees and Sadducees and high priests who get mad at Jesus for healing on the Sabbath. Mm-hmm. Well, that just told us who they sort of followed as their main rabbi, which was Shammai. And so it's an interesting thing. There's just getting some of that context of what's going on. The word Shema actually means to hear or to listen. Have you heard of this prayer before? Have you guys heard of it? I know obviously Brandon said he had, but had anybody else heard of this before?
No,
the Shema?
Mm-hmm. Nope.
Yeah, it's something that in the Jewish faith they say twice a day. It's actually comprised of 3 different passages, 2 from Deuteronomy and 1 from Numbers. And the one from Deuteronomy 6 is when the Israelites had been wandering through the desert for 40 years. Now they're finally ready to re-enter back into the promised land. Moses gathers all the people around. He's got them all out, and he actually recites the 10 Commandments back to them. And so there's actually 2 spots in the Bible where the 10 Commandments are talked about. And there's actually some similarities and differences there. I encourage anybody who's listening, or any of us, go check them out. There are some differences in them, and I think that's really kind of interesting. But these had already been recited to the people, but they just wandered through the desert for 40 years. Why do you think right before they go in, Moses gathers them all back up and says, hey, I'm just going to recite these back to you? Why does he do that?
Call back to purpose, I feel like.
Yeah.
I mean,
reminder.
We kind of screwed up the last 40 years before we get into this big gift.
You built a calf, a golden calf.
Yeah. So, I mean, a huge callback to purpose and a reminder, I feel like.
Yeah.
Fresh start.
Some of these people maybe do. They could have been children the first time this happened.
True.
Not to say they wouldn't know, but I just thought that was interesting. Like, he repeats them back to them. And the cool thing about what you mentioned, Spencer, is Deuteronomy is actually, the theme of that book is to remember. And so it's a call for all of Israelites to remember all throughout the book of Deuteronomy, which is fascinating. And I actually do. I think that's why he's like, hey, look, I'm going to recite these back to you. It's going to remind you of the mountain that I went up. It's going to remind you of the Egyptian slavery that you were in. And that's not who you are. Your purpose is to follow God. And it starts with the Lord your God. The Lord is your God, and the Lord your God is one. That's how that prayer starts. And it's a reminder that, hey, you may have seen a bunch of other gods. There's other gods in the culture. There's one God. And it's all about him. And here's how he says you are supposed to live. And then you can go in.
It's really interesting to kind of continue on with what you're talking about in Deuteronomy. So, yeah, it's a reminder of who they are in God and that they're supposed to love God. And then it goes through in Deuteronomy and talks about how they're supposed to relate to other people. I think it talks specifically about widows, orphans, and foreigners.
Mm-hmm.
Like the people that would be underprivileged in society, that they're supposed to specifically look out for them. And I think it's a callback to how they lived in Egypt.
Sure.
You know what I mean? That they were in that disadvantaged situation. And then from there, and it goes all the way from that point in Deuteronomy all the way up to the passage we're looking at in Mark. It's like a repeated cycle of Israel turning away from God, stopping taking care of the disadvantaged people like God tells them to, and starting to take advantage of them. And then things fall apart. And then they turn back to God, focus on God, loving people. Things go well. They get comfortable, and then they stop. And so it's kind of like a cycle. So it's interesting that that's like the whole story of the Old Testament, and Jesus calls that out. Like, this is what your focus is supposed to be.
Yeah, there's this, as soon as love God with all their heart, soul, and mind gets taken out of the picture, they crumble. Every single time. Yep. They go through the cycle over and over. And it's usually not just because they take God out, it's because they've replaced him with an idol of whatever that might be. And so this is always that constant reminder. And I think that's why they pray this at least twice a day, of reminding themselves, okay, God is who I'm supposed to be focused on. But what does it mean to love God with your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength? What does that mean? What does that mean? What does that look like? What does that actually look like? Like, I can say that all day long, and I can pray that prayer 100 times a day. What does that look like? Any thoughts before I continue down my deep research that I kind of dug into this a little bit? All right, I'll keep going. So there's actually two different thoughts in the Jewish community on this, and one is the traditional rabbinic idea. It's something that moves you into action. It's a practical way of walking with God. There's some other Jewish traditions where it's this intense longing for the presence of God, more of this, what some might call mystical of, or contemplation, sort of that just wanting to be in God's presence and commune with him at all times. Yeah. My mind practically goes to the rabbinic tradition. Like, how do I practically look like? What does that look like in my life?
Can we do a combo? Is that allowed?
Sure.
Okay, I choose combo.
That's just the way that my mind works. Okay. It's like, okay, what are the things I need to do?
yeah.
Kind of thing. I'm getting closer to the contemplation area. I would say, at least from even my own experience, like, feeling God has always been a little difficult. It's changed, but I think a lot of men probably feel that way. At least I did some research, and most men do. They have a trouble with the feeling part of God.
I wonder, I don't want to tie this to this like clear dichotomy, but I also wonder if it would tie into personality, like introvert versus
for
extrovert.
Sure. Anybody, like, do you guys like the feeling part of God, like that intense longing of presence and communing with him when he's not actually a physical presence? Like, is that something you find natural?
No.
Hard?
No, hard. And maybe it's personality, but I think it's more towards perfectionist tendencies than extroversion. I would say I'm pretty extroverted, and well, maybe that is it, but I always, the whole idea of trying to like feel God, I'm like, am I doing this right? Is that was that God?
Is that you?
Like that. And then I just get into my own head, and I get distracted. So maybe a little ADD in there too. But yeah, I do. I think I'm definitely one of those that struggles with the feeling and sitting with God.
I would say that mine kind of comes out of the context of whatever the situation is. So, like, if I learn a truth, or if I witness a truth happening to people I love in real life, or a song brings up the truth and I can feel it or sense it, then, I can feel it in my skin, or my, pulse might, race a little bit or something. But to me, it comes out of the context of how it's applied around life.
I would agree with that. Like, if I'm worshiping in church or something, like, it'll get sometimes I get a tear. I'm like, oh, okay.
Oh, yeah.
I feel that, Or it's, to me, it's also like relationally, like with you guys, I kind of feel God through you guys. Through the love that, we have for each other.
So if we look at each of these, Jesus says heart, soul, mind, and strength. So that's the four that we're going to look at. And I'll just say, so the reason why that is because in Hebrew language, there isn't a word for mind. And they actually think that the intellect actually came out of the heart, And so that's why in the Deuteronomy verse, it actually doesn't say mind. It's heart. And so
I always wondered that. Like one has 3
why
and
is it
one has
different?
4. Yeah.
Yeah. Why is it different? It's because they didn't have this concept of brain. There wasn't like a word. All the intellect came from the heart out, which you see in the language, in many times in Scripture where they talk about that a little bit. But like, what does loving God with your heart look like?
You know what's funny? I kind of put heart and soul together.
Sure.
And can't differentiate between that. I think I've asked before the group, like, what is y'all's understanding of what heart is and what soul is?
Yeah.
So before I try breaking it down in my mind, I understand this to mean like we're supposed to love God with our entire being, and then these are the different pieces.
So all 4 encompass absolutely every part of your life.
Yeah.
There is no part that is left out. So like,
he wasn't just spatting off 4 words.
No, he wasn't just spatting off 4 words. These 4
intention.
encompassed every single part of your life in any sort of which way. And there's some translation gymnastics that were done as I sort of worked through just kind of doing some research stuff, and maybe a link we can drop in here. There's actually something called a Shema series on Bible Project. There's 6 3 to 4 minute videos in there, and they actually walk through the 4 or 6 keywords, which he starts with here, which is Shema, and then he talks about Yahweh, which is the personal name for God and how they actually got to that, and then what love is. There's actually a bunch of different words for love, but the one here is Ahava, which is a very general word for love. It's not like a specific one. It's a very general word for love. And then heart is the word lev, which talks about like your affections and feelings, and even your will and intellect that sits in your heart. So like that's the part of your body that they're talking about here. The word soul, this is one of the ones they do a little word gymnastics. It's nefesh, and Brandon knows this word apparently. And this one is a little different. It actually isn't really talking about your soul. It's like your whole body.
It's like the life.
Yeah, it's like your body and your life. It's not like what we would think of like this. The analogy I heard was like a ghost in a jar.
Mine just went to Avatar for some reason. Like the life tree. Yeah.
No, yeah. Isn't nefesh, does that tie back to Adam and God breathing into him, I believe?
I thought it was nuach.
Oh, is that
or ruach? But nefesh is actually in Genesis.
Yeah. And it also, nefesh is when they're talking about like not eating blood out of animals. Like you have to
brings life.
Drain them because that's the life is in the blood. And so you're not supposed to take that.
So we've got like intellect, love God with your intellect and your feelings and your desires. You've got love God with your like life, love God with your mind. This one wasn't in the Hebrew one, so I don't have a Hebrew word for that one. It's actually combined with strength, which them combined would be the word miod, which can be a bunch of different things. It can be wealth, it can be strength, and it can be mind. But the word miod, what it actually translates to is muchness. Love God with your muchness, which means everything. Any part of you that is not mentioned, it's like sort of like a catch-all.
Oh,
like
the leftovers.
Yeah, like love God with everything. Everything else that's not here, love him with your muchness. And so what does this look like? Because when the Jewish community prays this, it's actually something that's supposed to drive them into action. Each one of them has an action component to it in their mind. And so like how do I do that practically?
I'm all ears.
Yeah, tell us, Billy.
I don't have any specific ones. I was hoping you guys would have some things maybe you've done from experience.
Sorry, can you repeat the question? Let me think about it.
So like how would you love God with your heart?
Sometimes I think the action is to point your heart back to that. It's like almost like examination of what is my heart seeking right now? Love God with all your heart. Because I feel like the intellect and all, like you use that phrase, like your heart's desires. For me, that's what I think back to is like, this is a call. And now knowing like if they're praying this and that's maybe a mindset 3 times a day, it's almost like a call of like, check your heart. Like what?
Yeah.
What is it pointing?
What is it leaning towards?
Where are the desires? Is it pulling you towards desires of the flesh and the world, or is it pulling you towards God? So that's what my translation of it.
Yeah, I've got it like
practically is like that reminding yourself every day. Like that's what I try and do in the mornings is like guide my heart today to what you want, not me.
yeah, for sure.
I kind of think like we humans use it in the context of people, like within interpersonally. Like it's just anytime we use the word heart, it's like he has a big heart, or we have a heart for this, or so like it has to do with us among others.
Sure. It could be like a relational thing for sure. Like,
Yeah.
hey, love them with your heart. Like, love
Yeah.
other people. Like, does your heart, well, so that's a question. Is your heart bent inwards towards you, or is your heart bent outwards towards serving others? That's always like practically, that's probably a good place to start.
Yeah. Well, you just said something, Cody, too, like that whole phrase, he has a heart for, insert XYZ cause, but translation is he cares deeply about that. And so
Yeah.
he has a heart for God.
Yeah.
He cares deeply about God. So
What about soul?
Back to what Cody said, I feel like they're the same, heart and soul.
Could be.
When I think of soul, I think of the word spirit too.
Oh yeah.
It's just like the part of our body that moves it. I don't know.
So if we use the
There's
Jewish
soul.
for like life,
It's what,
love God with your life.
yeah.
Everything outside, like outside of the inside of your body, but like your actions, your will, your life motivations. I don't know. Like, what does that look like? My initial mind thought goes to work. That's where we spend a bunch of time. Do I love God with my work?
I was putting that down under strength in my mind. But yeah, I think
Sure.
I kind of thought of it as what other people see.
Love God as a father to my kids, as a husband to my wife. Do I serve them well? Some days.
Seems like there's crossover between.
Oh, for sure. There is.
Yeah,
I think
there
that's
is
what it's
too.
meant to be. It's
Yeah,
supposed to encompass everything.
because you're
Does
an
father-
integrated person. Yeah.
Yeah. Husband and father and work, to me, they're all strength. That's love with your strength.
Sure.
For me.
Well, God's teaching us all about all of these individually, and so it comes out differently.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So they could be wonky in some different places. What about your, we'll use mind. What about your mind, your thoughts?
I think that your thoughts.
Big time.
Are your thoughts earthly or are they godly?
Can you influence them?
Heavenly.
Can you control them?
Can you?
Seems like
you can't always control.
Yeah.
Always.
It is
Yeah.
something we like to think we
You
can.
try-
We like to
But
think we can
it
control
sure
our
does
thoughts.
go
You tried
on.
to sneak one in there on me.
It sure does go on autopilot.
You
We
cannot
like to think we
control-
can.
You can control how you act upon them. but
We
not
can.
What pops up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But
I
we
do think
can't.
you have influence.
I do. I actually do. I believe you very much have influence. And that's through what you read, what you listen to in the radio,
Yeah.
or
Neuroplasticity.
Yep.
Gets fired, gets wired.
What
Yeah.
you're,
Yeah.
I mean, what you're searching, what you're scrolling through on social media.
what
all
pictures
of
show
that.
up on your phone.
Yeah.
Like anything that gets inputted in can translate into a thought.
And unfortunately, what we speak also can be influenced on our phones
They're
too.
listening.
So
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because you can here's the thing is you can do all you can to, if you ever struggle with a porn addiction, like you've basically ingrained those photos into your mind. So yes, you can put your phone away and you can throw it out the door. You can never get on a computer again. But guess what? Those thoughts, those pictures, those videos, they still pop up in your mind. And you can dwell on them. You can still lust over them, even though you don't have a phone or tech or anything. It's not even
Yeah.
physical in front of you. And so I often think we don't think about those types of things. The music that we listen to, where it's talking about shooting people or alcohol or drugs. Yeah, sure. It's not in front of us. But do we think about doing those things on bad days? I don't know. Maybe we don't hear, but there's been times where I have, for sure.
So I know transformed by the renewing of your mind fits in right here.
It does.
Yeah.
I didn't put it in
replace
here,
them.
but yes, it absolutely
you
does.
definitely can't delete it like it's easy to delete
It's
something
not
off
just
your
a delete
phone,
button. Yeah.
but you can coat over it with many layers of good stuff. And, God does it. Takes stuff away, like the desire to drink, is like that was there and now it's not there.
Mhm.
So just interesting. It's interesting, like the people, like when they put people in a in a isolation chamber, like people go insane.
Yeah.
So like your thoughts, you're just left there with your thoughts. You don't have anything feeding it except
And no outlet for it either.
and no outlet for it.
And maybe you're scared to face your thoughts. I think that's why a lot of people don't like to sit alone by themselves, because you're sitting with just your thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on what those are, those could be scary. They could be painful. They could hurt. That's why community is important.
Oh man, I was right there
go.
too. I mean, like, if there's anything that's helpful for the mind, it's like to get out of it, in which you share minds with others. That's loving God with all your mind has got to be, I'm not loving Him with all my mind if I'm keeping it all in.
Yeah, or just worry about the future.
Yeah,
I think soul goes in there too.
Sure.
The you saying that loving God with all your, like, that's definitely soul for me.
Yeah,
the connection between heart and heaven.
Mm-hmm.
I got to say it too, because I represent music in here. So soul, when you think of somebody that has heart and soul, like they've got their soul in their music, like they're into it, and the music comes out just that much more, authentically or something like that. So
I don't know, the word that just keeps on going through my head is like wholeness or integration.
Yeah.
Like for all of these pieces, like the heart, soul, mind, and strength, like you can't separate one from the other. These are just different aspects of it. And that ties into even the community thing. I think from the very beginning, God Himself is in community, and He created us to be in community with Him and then with others. And there's meant to be this integration, which ties back to the Shema about first it's loving God and then loving others.
Yeah. Because once you get that right about what is God's love towards you and how do you love God back, then you can then learn how to go love other people well. Like we were talking about earlier, like what are those blockers? Well, guess what? Once you understand your relationship with God and His relationship with you, you can get over those. It's hard, but you can get over them.
And what about if you love others the way that God loves you?
That's a whole. I feel like we could branch off.
That's
a whole another story.
That's next week.
I think
Perfect.
I love what you just said, though, Brandon, about there's a lot of integration, but I do believe that they can operate independently, and that can be a roadblock. Like for me, a long time, my whole journey with God was so focused on the mind and so little on the heart. I would spend every day reading scripture, and my mind, I gave thoughts and I gave space and real estate in my thoughts to God, but my heart wasn't there. So I wasn't really allowing it to transform me. It was more performative to say I did it. So it was interesting how, like, if you don't do all of it, like to your point, and let that integrate,
it becomes fragmented. It doesn't work like it's
It's
intended.
a great picture of like my faith journey.
Yeah.
Honestly, like even joining the church we're at now, 14 years ago, I was scratching the surface. I was reading it, but it wasn't a deep love for it.
Yeah.
And
there's me and Brandon are reading a book right now, and they asked a priest from Africa, and he says, "What's the difference between African Christians and American Christians?" Thinks about it for a second and says, "American Christians are focused on knowledge. African Christians worship and are transformed." That one hit me like a ton of bricks. And it's not to say that knowledge is bad. Like it is helpful in understanding these things, but if it's just knowledge for knowledge's sake and it's not transforming into action that's walked out, it's really for nothing.
Yeah, I remember you guys sharing this, and I said, I mean, it goes back to a text all of us had about simplicity. Are we we got to keep it simple?
So as we end this podcast, maybe this is a little bit of different for you, but we hope you kind of just step away with an understanding that everything we do, no matter what it is, it starts with loving God and also understanding His love for you. We have to get that relationship right first before we can get any of the other relationships in our life right. Rather you lean more towards the practical side of things, or maybe you are on the mystical side where you can, have that feeling or that intense longing or contemplation of who God is. Like if you're really good at that, like lean into one of those sides. But I also want you to think about how can you love God more with every single part of you? Are there places in your life that are out of alignment? How do you get them back into alignment? How do you love them with your heart and your soul and your strengths and your mind? So wherever you are, wherever you're listening to this, find a quiet space sometime in the day and just stop. Feel God's presence just pour over you. Hear his promises of his words, bring life back into you, to bring you purpose, to bring you being, to bring you fulfillment, and just behold who God is. Cool?
Yeah. Just last thought for you listeners. If you have any other thoughts on heart, soul, mind, strength, please add them to the comments. Hit us up. We want to know what your thoughts are too.
Yeah.
So,
well, thanks for listening, y'all. We'll catch you on the next one.